I'd like to say that I'm a dance teacher who researches community response to human trafficking. Now, these two identities of mine often confuse people. Namely, the parents of the dancers I teach wondering why I research sexual violence, and the researchers of my PhD program wondering why I still teach dance. There have been 4 years of my life where I haven't been formally dancing, either as a student or as an instructor. 3 of those years were when I was first born, but the other was my first year of graduate school. During this time, I realized that something was missing, that having both those identities, Lauren the dancer and Lauren the researcher, were critical to my involvement in the anti-trafficking work. Since then, my identity as a dancer has helped me understand my work on sex trafficking in a way that my researcher identity alone cannot, and has helped me see what the future of the anti-trafficking movement can look like. I've witnessed how incorporating creativity and the arts can positively impact victims or survivors of sex trafficking as they rebuild their lives. So, what is sex trafficking? Maybe we've heard of it happening in other countries. Maybe we've seen the movie Taken and heard about one man's very particular set of skills for getting his daughter back. Maybe we've seen viral social media posts about suburban women being approached in malls, on the streets, in parking lots. But the reality is, these are myths. The reality is, maybe you went to school with somebody who was a victim of this crime. Maybe you walked by them on the sidewalk. But more likely, maybe you haven't seen them at all. Because the truth is that sex trafficking does happen in the United States, in every state, in both rural and in urban areas. It's such a well-hidden crime that law enforcement and researchers, whose sole job it is to find this information out, don't even have accurate statistics. 20 years ago, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed in the United States to define human trafficking, to include both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. It's a federal law that makes it illegal to sell a person for the purposes of labor or sex using elements of force, fraud, or coercion. 20 years ago, those misconceptions I just talked about started being put into our heads through sensationalized media representations and just general misinformation about trafficking. And anti-trafficking activists work against these misconceptions daily to ensure that survivors of trafficking, who most likely don't look like those people we see in the media, don't go overlooked, and so they can get the care and justice that they deserve. A couple years ago, I conducted a study to determine just how we're looking at sex trafficking in this country and how it's being portrayed in the media. After reading every newspaper story on sex trafficking in the year 2016 and comparing my findings to a similar study that was done about a decade prior, I discovered that the way we're approaching sex trafficking in this country is largely from a criminal legal perspective. So what we're seeing in the news are stories about sting operations or undercover operations by police, or prosecutions of traffickers when possible, but rarely do we hear about the victims or the people that are affected by these crimes. The overall trend from the early 2000s onward has been that sex trafficking can happen to anyone, anywhere. However, since then we've established that this is just not the case, and that what we know from the reliable research and data that we do have is that certain groups of people, often the most marginalized in our communities, are the ones that are at risk of being trafficked. Yet what seems to be lacking is a discussion of those social identities that put people at risk. A similar trend continues when we look at our academic research on sex trafficking. I conducted a study where I looked at every article published on sex trafficking in the United States in the last 10 years, where survivors were directly interviewed about their experiences. Yet very few of these studies actually discussed any other social identity these people had other than the fact that they were trafficked. So what does that mean? This means that we're systematically defining sex trafficking survivors solely based on their trafficking experience, paying little to no attention to any other social identity or quality that they have that defines them, silencing what really makes them who they are and focusing only on that terrible thing that they had to endure. Imagine if the worst thing to ever happen to you is the only way that people define or remembered you by. I suspect that's not how we're all going to go introduce ourselves to each other, right? Instead, we all have things that make us different as people. Our race, our sexual identity, our gender identity, where we live, what we like to do for fun, all these things contribute to how we are treated and experience the world. and they're important to include both in our research on sex trafficking, but also in how we represent it in the media. Doing so can focus on those social identities in a way that we are currently ignoring. About 8 years ago, I was at a training for a sex trafficking street outreach program in Chicago. And we were going through that, icebreaker activity where you introduce yourself, say what you like to do for fun. And it came to my turn and I said, I'm Lauren and I like to teach dance classes. The facilitator of this training stopped and she asked me, could you teach us to dance? I'll come back to that in a second. What that question brings up has to do with these social identities that we keep ignoring. I recently spent time working with researchers at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and they spent time collaborating with practitioners, researchers, and survivors of sex trafficking from all over the world. They came together to create collaborative pieces of artwork, as seen here. These pieces of artwork were displayed throughout the conference space. This process, it aimed to equalize the power differentials among all the participants, regardless of education, race, what country they were from, what language they spoke, and helped to bridge across those communication barriers. These pieces of artwork were hung throughout the conference space, throughout the entire meeting, and served as a reminder of that equalizing process that connected them all. Those social identities that we keep ignoring, we keep silencing. We are so much more than those terrible things that happen to us. So survivors then are surely more than those terrible things that happen to them. So then why aren't we focusing our work in the anti-trafficking movement on those social identities, and how can we do a better job of this in the next 20 years? That question where the facilitator asked me what we like to do for fun after we're doing our icebreaker activity. She stopped me after I said I like to teach dance. And she asked me, could you teach us to dance? She proceeded to tell me that after she exited her trafficking situation, or the life as it's called, she was at a residential facility where there was only woodworking available as an activity for her and other survivors. During this time, when she would wake up in the middle of the night due to her nightmares from her trauma, she would build a table or a chair. And not to say that those things weren't helpful for her, but when other survivors started to join in and say that they too wished that they knew how to dance, I figured that we were onto something that we may have missed. This conversation has stuck with me, and I come back to it every time I start a new research or evaluation project. It reminds me that how important it is to listen to those that we are working alongside to develop solutions that are most meaningful to them. In this instance, it seemed that having a dance program would have been more meaningful to this group of survivors than having that woodworking program alone. And to be sure, I'm not the only one who has recognized the use of dance in the arts, like seen in my visit at University of Wisconsin-Madison. In my work in the local area, I've seen community members use dance and art as a form of healing, as a mode of expression, as a way to raise awareness about sex trafficking, and as seen in my example, as an icebreaker activity. Dance has the power for survivors to take back control over their body, reclaim it as their own, in whatever way or pace they need to. Dance is a way to reclaim and celebrate that power over the body. And the best part is, everything you need to do it is right here. I'm a member of the state and a couple local human trafficking task forces, and every time I stay after to talk with folks in those meetings, it's always after mentioning something about dance, rarely about something with my researcher identity. These conversations have led to incorporating sex trafficking prevention into existing community programs, and me teaching dance classes at a drop-in center for youth who are at risk of being trafficked or who are already been trafficked. Could you teach us to dance? This is the reason why I've worked so hard to keep both my dancer identity and my researcher identity in doing this work on sex trafficking. This question, for me to act on it, and having so much meaning to those survivors did not require me to utilize my researcher identity. It did not require me to have a master's degree or a PhD, but it did require me to have two other things. One, to have listened to somebody who is an expert in their own life and their own needs, and two, to be a compassionate, non-judgmental human. Now, these two things aren't unique to the anti-trafficking work, but they can also be used in your communities and in the relationships that you have. They also represent where I envision and hope that the next 20 years of the anti-trafficking movement can go. We should build upon the progress that we've made on having survivor-centered interventions drive this movement, but we should take it a step further. We should have survivor-centered come to mean human-centered, so that we stop ignoring and focus on those other social identities and qualities that make survivors who they are as people. The way we can do this is incorporating dance and the arts into our research activities, our program evaluations, and the programs that we develop for survivors in their communities. Doing so can help survivors understand and celebrate their multiple identities in the way that you and I have been able to celebrate ours. Thank you.